The Ishmaelites are descendants of Ishmael, the son of Abraham and Hagar, an Egyptian servant of Sarah. The history of the Ishmaelites is rich and full of important meanings to understand how God, even in difficult situations, still has a greater plan in action. Although Ishmael was not the son of promise, he was still blessed by God. The Bible shows us that the Ishmaelites became a great nation, and their trajectory reveals both the blessings and the challenges they faced over the centuries. Ishmael grew up to become the patriarch of a great lineage, forming a nation that played an important role in biblical history. Although the Ishmaelites are often remembered for the conflicts that arose with the descendants of Isaac, their story also offers lessons of faith, perseverance, and the promises of God. Ishmael's story begins with a situation of pain and despair. Hagar, Sarah's Egyptian servant, was chosen to bear a son for Abraham when Sarah, who had been barren until then, no longer believed she could have children. Hagar gave birth to Ishmael, Abraham's first son. Although Ishmael was not the child of promise that God had planned for Abraham, he was not forgotten or neglected by the Lord. God had a special plan for him, as we see in Genesis 16 verses 10 to 12. When Hagar fled into the wilderness, feeling rejected and forsaken by Sarah, the angel of the Lord appeared to her and brought her a message of hope and comfort. "I will multiply your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." Genesis 16 verse 10. This was the moment when God revealed that Ishmael, the son she was expecting, would have a significant future and would become the patriarch of a great nation. Even in a situation of conflict and despair, God extended his grace and care to Hagar and her son. The promise made to Ishmael is a testament to God's love and mercy for all of his children. Although Ishmael was not the covenant child, God blessed him greatly. In Genesis 17 verse 20, God reinforces this promise by saying to Abraham, "As for Ishmael, I have heard you. See, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply him exceedingly. He will father 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation." This blessing shows that the Lord cares for those who may sometimes seem forgotten or left out. The ordeal of Hagar and Ishmael in the wilderness is one of the most intense and emotional moments in the biblical narrative. After the birth of Isaac, the son of Sarah and Abraham, the tension between Sarah and Hagar increased. Isaac was the son of promise, and Sarah feared that Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn, might inherit the blessing destined for her son. So she asked Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away. Reluctantly, but obeying his wife's request, Abraham gave Hagar bread and water and sent them away into the wilderness. Genesis 21 verse 14. This was an extremely difficult time for Hagar and Ishmael. Alone in the wilderness of Beersheba, they soon faced a shortage of water. The desert, with its relentless heat and harsh environment, posed a great threat to their survival. When all the water ran out and Hagar, in despair, placed Ishmael under a bush, walking away so as not to see him die, it seemed as if there was no hope left. Genesis 21 verses 15 to 16. However, it is precisely in these moments of despair that God's grace and mercy are manifested. Hagar wept, but it was Ishmael's voice that God heard. In Genesis 21 verse 17, the angel of the Lord appeared and said to Hagar, "Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is." This statement is a powerful reminder that God sees and hears those in distress, even when all seems lost. He knew the plight of Ishmael and his mother and was ready to intervene. God then opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well of water. This well symbolizes God's provision in the midst of adversity. When everything seemed to be running out, God provided what was necessary for Hagar and Ishmael to survive. This gesture was not only a physical solution to their thirst, but also a sign of God's ongoing care. This story teaches us that even in times of scarcity and difficulty, God is present. When we find ourselves in the desert of life, without apparent resources, He is ready to open our eyes and show us His provision. Hagar and Ishmael's ordeal in the desert is a testament to the fact that God's compassion never fails. even in the most desperate situations. After being rescued by God in the desert, Ishmael grew up and settled in Paran, an arid and challenging region. Genesis 21 verse 20 tells us that God was with the child, and he grew, and he lived in the wilderness and became an archer. This simple statement conceals a great significance about Ishmael's character and journey. His life in the desert shaped him into a special skill. He became a skilled archer, a symbol of his strength, resilience, and adaptability. The fact that Ishmael became an archer tells us a lot about his life story. The desert was not an easy place, and surviving there required more than physical strength. It required ingenuity, patience, and determination. The bow and arrow, both a tool for hunting and defense, symbolized the independence that Ishmael developed. He not only learned to survive in a hostile environment, but thrived in it, using his skills to ensure the survival of his family. This image of Ishmael as an archer reflects the strong and determined spirit that he passed on to his descendants. The bow requires precision and focus, qualities that were essential to Ishmael as he faced the challenges of living in the desert. Life in the desert also represents a metaphor for times of trial and difficulty. Just as Ishmael learned to use the bow to face adversity, he also developed an inner resilience that influenced the identity of his descendants, the Ishmaelites. Furthermore, Ishmael's skill with the bow can be seen as a reflection of his independence. He and his mother, Hagar, were estranged from Abraham and his family, but God was with him and blessed him. Ishmael was not just a survivor, but a leader, someone who paved his own way with divine help. The fact that he thrived in the wilderness shows how God can turn difficult situations into opportunities for growth and success. Ishmael's emergence as the father of a great nation was a direct fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. Although Ishmael was not the covenant son, God assured Abraham that he too would be blessed. In Genesis 17 verse 20, God declared, "As for Ishmael, I have heard you. See, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply him exceedingly. He will beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation." This promise not only guaranteed Ishmael's survival, but also established a prosperous future for him and his descendants. The 12 princes mentioned were the leaders of the tribes that would emerge from Ishmael, constituting the Ishmaelites, one of the largest tribes in the Middle East. These tribes, scattered throughout the desert, became a strong and influential nation, establishing deep roots in the region. Ishmael, whose own life began in difficult circumstances, became the patriarch of a great lineage, reflecting God's provision and faithfulness even outside the lineage of the Messianic promise. The Ishmaelites, descendants of Ishmael, distinguished themselves as traders and warriors. Their dominance of the desert gave them a natural advantage on the trade routes that crossed the region, especially those involving spices, precious metals, and other valuable goods. The Ishmaelites became known for their caravans that traveled great distances, connecting different regions of the Middle East and beyond. Their skill in trade made them a significant economic force. In addition to being traders, the Ishmaelites were also skilled warriors, able to defend their lands and trade routes. They formed important alliances with other tribes and nations throughout history. The influence of the Ishmaelites is mentioned in several biblical passages. A notable example is the Ishmaelites' involvement in the sale of Jacob's son Joseph into slavery in Egypt. In Genesis 37 verse 28, we read that the Midianite merchants came by and drew Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought him to Egypt. This episode demonstrates the presence and role of the Ishmaelites in trade networks and interactions with other nations. The Ishmaelites, throughout biblical history, had a lasting influence in the Middle East. Their ability to establish themselves in a harsh and hostile land and form a powerful nation is a testament to the fulfillment of God's promise to Ishmael. Even though he was not the heir to the covenant, Ishmael was blessed with strength, resilience, and a legacy that endured for generations. The Ishmaelites played a significant role in the story of Joseph, one of the most memorable episodes in the book of Genesis. When Joseph, Jacob's favorite son, was betrayed by his own brothers, he was sold into slavery by the Ishmaelites. In Genesis 37 verse 28, we read, "As the Midianite merchants passed by, they drew Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they took him to Egypt." This moment was a pivotal point in Joseph's life, but it was also part of a much larger plan of God. At that moment, Joseph was just a young man abandoned by his own family and left to an uncertain future in the hands of strangers. Yet God was in control of the entire situation. The Ishmaelites, though they seemed like ordinary merchants, were used by God to bring Joseph to Egypt, where he would later be elevated to a position of great authority. The Ishmaelites' involvement in this story shows us one of the ways God works. Even in the midst of betrayal and pain, the Lord was orchestrating events to fulfill his purpose. Joseph, sold into slavery, eventually became the second most powerful man in Egypt, responsible for saving countless lives during a great famine, including the lives of his own family, who had betrayed him. The presence of the Ishmaelites in this event also demonstrates how God can use any person or circumstance, even those who seem to be outside the greater plan of promise. The Ishmaelites and the Midianites are two tribes that share a common origin. They are both descendants of Abraham. While the Ishmaelites descend from Ishmael, Abraham's son with Hagar, the Midianites are descendants of Midian, one of Abraham's sons with his wife Keturah, as mentioned in Genesis 25 verses 1-4. The connection between these two tribes, which appears in several biblical passages, reveals the complexity of the relationships between the different nations that arose from Abraham. In Genesis 37 verse 28, when Joseph's brothers decide to sell him as a slave, the text mentions both the Ishmaelites and the Midianites as part of the caravan of traders who bought him. This suggests that these two tribes often joined forces in their commercial activities. Together, they formed alliances that allowed them to prosper in trade and in their travels in the desert. Their caravans carried valuable goods such as spices, incense, and precious metals, connecting distant regions of the Middle East and North Africa. The close relationship between the Ishmaelites and the Midianites can be seen as a strategic union. The desert was an unforgiving and challenging environment, requiring cooperation between the tribes to survive and thrive. The caravans were often targeted by robbers, and the alliance between the Ishmaelites and the Midianites made them stronger and more secure during their long trade journeys. This alliance also reflects a broader reality about Abraham's descendants. Although they were not part of the line of the Messianic promise, which ran through Isaac and Jacob, both the Ishmaelites and the Midianites maintained a deep connection to Abraham and thus shared a sense of common identity. This identity was, in part, the basis for their alliances and cooperation. Another notable example of the presence of the Midianites and Ishmaelites together is found in the story of Gideon in the book of Judges. In Judges 6, we see that the Midianites, in alliance with other desert tribes, oppressed the Israelites, plundering their lands and taking their crops. Gideon, chosen by God, was the leader who, with only 300 men, defeated the Midianite army, weakening their alliance with other tribes, including the Ishmaelites. This type of alliance between the tribes descended from Abraham, despite often involving them in conflict with Israel, reveals the bond shared by these nations and the importance of their relations in the context of the ancient history of the Middle East. The alliance between the Ishmaelites and the Midianites demonstrates how nations, despite their differences and distinct origins, sought to prosper in the midst of adversity, showing the interconnection between the descendants of Abraham over the generations. Therefore, the collaboration between the Ishmaelites and the Midianites was not only a matter of survival, but also a reflection of the complex web of relationships between the descendants of Abraham. The history of these two peoples shows us how, even outside the direct lineage of promise, they played important and influential roles in the biblical narrative and in the history of the region. The legacy of the Ishmaelites is vast and complex, extending far beyond the confines of the biblical narrative. As descendants of Ishmael, Abraham's first son, the Ishmaelites occupied an important place in the history of the Middle East, God's promise to Abraham that Ishmael would become the father of a great nation, Genesis 17 verse 20, was fulfilled in a remarkable way, with the Ishmaelites settling in various regions and playing prominent roles in cultures and societies throughout the centuries. The descendants of Ishmael settled primarily in the Arabian Peninsula, where they became one of the most influential tribes in the region. They were known for their trading skills, and their caravans traveled across vast areas, connecting the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia. These caravans carried valuable goods such as spices, frankincense, and gold, making the Ishmaelites central to the region's economy. Although the Ishmaelites are often portrayed as rivals to Isaac's descendants, especially in stories of conflict with the Israelites, the Bible also recognizes that they are part of God's plan. God did not abandon Ishmael, but blessed him with a large number of descendants and a significant inheritance. The promise to multiply his descendants and make him a great nation was a clear demonstration that God has care and a purpose for all of Abraham's descendants, even those who were not directly included in the Messianic covenant. Today, the legacy of the Ishmaelites is reflected in diverse forms throughout history and geography. Originally, Ishmael's descendants settled primarily in the Arabian Peninsula and played significant roles as traders and warriors. Over time, their influence expanded, and the Ishmaelites left an indelible mark on the history of cultures and nations throughout the Middle East and beyond. The Ishmaelites' diaspora shaped the ancient world and continues to impact the present. In historical context, the influence of the Ishmaelites extended from the trade routes of Arabia to the formation of the first great civilizations in the region. Their caravans, which carried spices and valuable products, not only facilitated trade but also promoted cultural exchange and economic development between the regions they connected. With the advent of Islam in the 7th century, the descendants of Ishmael, especially in Arab communities, began to play a prominent role in world history. Islam regards Ishmael as a significant patriarch, and many of the Arab peoples who see themselves as descendants of Ishmael have played crucial roles in global politics, economics, and culture over the centuries.